Hi everyone, welcome to Module 3, in which we talk about the internet, digital media, and media convergence. Specifically, we will be talking about the economic infrastructure of the internet in the context of the discussions we've been having about the economic infrastructure of today's media industries. And you'll recall that last time we talked about the advertising structure that includes some audiences but precludes other kinds of audiences. And today when we talk about the internet and how it has a particular revenue stream, we'll think about what that means for how the internet is used, what the World Wide Web means as we think about global media industries, but also particular decisions that have been made along the way to make the internet something that's free and available to everyone without a fee. So I'll be drawing specifically on Chapter 2 of your textbook, and Chapter 2 is called, the same as this lecture, the Internet, Digital Media, and Media Convergence. And you'll see that there are some things that are emphasized in this lecture, some key terms, some particular historical points that I really want you to pay attention to. So let's start with this notion. In the textbook, the authors quote Time magazine, and they say in this Time magazine article that, quote, experiences don't feel fully real until we have tweeted them, tumbled them, or YouTubed them. So I'm wondering how you feel about that statement, whether or not this is something that is relevant to you, something you agree with or disagree with. And as we go along with today's lecture, we'll think about what has happened that makes this feel true. Part of what has happened has been the rise of portable social media, as described in the textbook. And as scholars, I'm a media effects scholar, I'm now studying topics that didn't exist prior to the widespread use of certain kinds of platforms or devices. I think a good example of this is a phenomenon that I'm looking at right now with adolescents called FOMO, or the fear of missing out. So that term was one that was coined by a Harvard Business School student, more in the context of business than in the context of social lives of adolescents. But it's something that's been appropriated by the social sciences and has recently been studied as recently as the last 10 years. So fear of missing out, or FOMO, is generally the anxiety that something exciting might be happening while you're off doing something else. And that is a phenomenon that has been only exacerbated by social media. So a UK scholar, Andrew Przybylski, has applied FOMO, the scale of FOMO, to social media use. And I give you an example of this. You can see the full questions in the PowerPoint slides that I have loaded up into files. But this will give you a sense of how it gets measured. Typically, it's on a Likert type scale, which is a 5 or 7 point scale, in which the respondent says, or the participant says that this statement is not at all true of me or extremely true of me. And some examples are, I feel others have more rewarding experiences than me. That's one that you could think is not true of you or extremely true of you. I get worried when I find out my friends are having fun without me. So these kinds of feelings get stronger, particularly for adolescents, as the ability to really track what people are doing or think that you know what people are doing has exploded with social media platforms and, of course, portable media like smartphones. If we think specifically about social media and how it can foster a fear of missing out, we can think about what makes us stay connected online all the time. Part of it has to do with what we call technological affordances. And those that term applies in this context to what's built in either to our devices or to the platforms that we use that encourage us to keep going back to that platform or keep that device on. So it could be posting something and then tracking to see how many people like it or heart it. Other kinds of technological affordances could be, even if you put your sound on vibrate, you still feel that buzz, and so you still feel that urge to check what's going on. Other kinds of sounds like the chirps that come with Twitter, and certainly lights will come on when you have a notification. Even if your phone is off and vibrate is off, you still will get a light on your phone. And so these sorts of things make, in some ways, the smartphone that's connected to the internet, of course, make it feel like it's an extension of yourself. It's almost like if you put it aside, you're missing something. You have a sense that it's almost like an appendage, and if it's not there, you feel like you've lost an important tool. And so for those who have grown up really never knowing anything else, it can feel like if you don't have your smartphone with you, if you aren't connected to the internet, that there will be something significant that you've missed. Now, I used to, back when I was teaching about media effects prior to the widespread use of the smartphone, I used to give students an exercise, and I would ask them to go on a media diet, and I would say, don't use media for 24, 48 hours and see what you're missing. And of course, I can't do that now. I can't do it in the context of remote learning, but I also can't do it because this is really the only way that most people are connected. So if we think about fear of missing out and what it means, it's not just that kind of anxiety that comes along with wondering what other people are doing and feeling like they're having fun without you, but it can have other consequences for well-being. And this is something that I've been studying with adolescents. So specifically, I've been interested in understanding how nighttime smart media use or smartphone use has affected sleep. And I've been really interested in understanding who are the adolescents who really stay up all night and stay connected to their friends and stay connected to the internet, and how does this affect them. And I have found that adolescents who score high on FOMO, that scale that I showed you, are also significantly more likely to have their phone on and in the bed with them and being constantly woken up throughout the night. And of course, not having good sleep affects all kinds of other markers of well-being. Those who don't get enough sleep are more likely to suffer from depression and irritability. They're also more likely to gain weight, and there's a host of reasons why that's the case. But they're also, those who are smartphone dependent are more likely to have low self-esteem. So these are the kinds of things that we worry about and pay attention to as we're trying to understand what accessible, portable media mean, particularly when they're connected to the internet. So I want to spend a few minutes thinking about how we got here. And in the textbook, they give you a sort of brief history of the internet. And I'll give you some highlights in the next 10 minutes or so of this part of Module 3. So one question that we can ask ourselves is, what is the internet? Right? So I have a clip in Module 3 where I show you, it's just about 3 or 4 minutes, Jon Stewart, who's kind of mocking Senator Ted Stevens. This is in 2006. And Ted Stevens at the time was the head of the Telecommunications Committee that was charged with regulating the internet. And one of the challenges that we have as a society in regulating the internet is that not a lot of people really understand what the internet is, and how sort of mechanically it works, or even how philosophically it works. And in this particular clip, we have Ted Stevens trying to explain how the email that one of his staffers sent him on Friday didn't get to him until Monday. And he was trying to explain it as a way of advocating for a particular policy, which we'll talk about later in the semester. net neutrality. But that's not the point here. The point here is that trying to make policy or trying to think through the policy implications of certain kinds of political positions is one that is challenging for people who have not grown up with these technologies, but also who don't fully understand them. And it's not really clear who fully understands them except for the people who made them, because everybody has a little piece of it. So the internet actually, and this is a definition that comes from your textbook, is that vast network of telephone and cable lines and also wireless connections, satellite systems, that are designed to link and carry digital information worldwide. So that's the internet. Now, it's been described in various ways. Initially, then Senator Al Gore, who later went on to become vice president, he described the internet as it was first being developed as an information superhighway. And he was one who advocated that this highway could open up access to medical information, to job applications, to communicating with one another. And he was really all about making the internet something that was free and accessible for all, almost like a public right. In the textbook, they kind of use the terms internet and World Wide Web interchangeably and in ways that aren't fully defined. So I just wanted to take a moment to think about what the difference is between internet and World Wide Web. So the web, or the World Wide Web, or www, right, because that's what starts out many URLs, includes websites and individual pages that host the content and visuals that users interact with. So Canvas, what we're using to interact with one another here, is something that is a part of the World Wide Web. But the internet, on the other hand, in contrast, is something that represents that core of the web. So it's that actual network of cable or hardwire or satellite generated connections that undergird or support those websites and individual pages. So it's sort of the technical part of it. Now, I want to point out that when you see me writing internet, I don't actually capitalize this. And the internet was capitalized when it was kind of first becoming talked about and written about. And it wasn't until recently that the New York Times said, along with other grammarians, said we shouldn't capitalize internet. In the textbook they do, but I insist that we don't. And I insist on that for the same reason I don't capitalize the word television. The internet is a thing, it's not a place. So there's no reason to use a proper noun and use capitalization in this case. World Wide Web is a place, so you would capitalize that. All right, so another thing I want you to ponder for a moment. So who owns the internet? Is it the telecommunications companies? Is it the Defense Department? Is it the US government? Or does no one own it? So you might say, okay, I'm thinking about all of those companies that seem to be really big players, Google and Apple and Amazon. Do they own it? So the answer is that no one owns it. In the textbook, they make an important distinction between ownership and control. So just because there may be some companies that control the internet in significant ways or dominate the internet, they don't actually own it. So let's think about how one comes to dominate or control the internet or the web. One is that you are a company that provides access to it. For example, you could be a giant cable company. You could be a company that controls search engines. So in the book, there's a discussion about search engines and data aggregators. Or third, you could be the person or the company that sells those essential devices. So in each of those categories, you can think about companies that seem to dominate or seem to control the internet, And in the book, they describe what those companies are. And I'd like you to take a look at those so that you can kind of line up who's providing access, who's controlling the search engines, and who's selling the essential devices. So see if you can match up those companies with those three ways of controlling or dominating the web. We can ask ourselves important questions, and these are questions that are asked in the TED Talk that I'm having you take a look at. Should people have equal access to the internet, or should it be available primarily to those who can afford it? Should it be free, or should everybody pay a little bit to be a part of that ecosystem? And what are the pros and cons of a free internet? So with these questions, I want you to take a look at this TED Talk by Jaron Lanier. And I've provided a summary here, but essentially what Lanier is known for is helping to be one of the founders of the internet as a public commons. So he had a vision, and his vision, like Al Gore's, was one where the internet would allow people to share knowledge. But now, this many decades later, he's rethinking whether or not that vision was appropriate and what has happened for a free and accessible internet that has created what he calls a globally tragic, astoundingly ridiculous mistake. What has happened with Google and Facebook that have really created a digital culture that is unhealthy and problematic? So take a look at that TED Talk with the previous questions in mind and think about how you would respond. Specifically, think about Lanier's position on the development of a free and accessible internet, and think about what his current feelings are and what labels he puts on Google and Facebook, and what he would do to change, if he were to go back in time to change what the internet is all about. So back to the origins of the internet. So it began, as many of you may know, as a military government project. And the idea was in the Defense Department that there needed to be a way for researchers to share computer processing time, because these computers were enormous and they took up lots of space and they were incredibly expensive. And the primary goal of the internet was to allow people to have time on these big mainframe computers and share them. So they created this wired network system that allowed users from multiple locations around the US and ultimately around the world that could log on to that computer mainframe or that computer system when they needed it. And in the book, they describe packet switching as a process of breaking down messages into smaller pieces and then more easily routing them through multiple paths on the network so that they could be reassembled on the other end. The Defense Department also invented email. How about that? In 1971, an engineer named Ray Tomlinson developed software to send electronic mail messages to any computer on that Defense Department net, ARPANET. Another thing I want you to look up in the textbook is this @ symbol. So why did he use it? And of course, email is so useful and functional, and it was something that was adopted almost immediately by universities and research labs and corporations that were involved in tech. And in fact, I remember when I was a university student in the 1990s, specifically the early 1990s, using email for the first time to communicate with my professors, to send them my work, and thinking, oh, I don't actually have to physically locate myself on campus or physically deliver a paper, find a stapler and everything. And that was revolutionary for me a couple of decades ago, 3 decades ago, sorry. So what happened that brought to bring the internet into people's homes? So the first thing out of the Defense Department, out of universities, was really the introduction of personal computers. So many of us, myself included, in the 80s and 90s, if we wanted to use a computer, we had to do it at the university where we were studying or at that office where we were working. But Apple, of course, developed a personal computer, which was then widely copied by companies like Hewlett-Packard, and people could purchase them for a couple $1,000s and use them. Then a second development that happened to widen the audience for the internet were fiber optic cables, which then were slowly wiring cities that sped up the transmission of data. Then, of course, the invention of the World Wide Web. It was initially this data linking system, but then it became something that allowed people to navigate from one place on the web to another place on the web, right? So these web browsers that helped people navigate the web, like early on Safari, were critical for people to be able to find what they were looking for. And then finally, the deployment of search engines that helped to organize the web. And we see today the most prominent one, Google, but also Baidu. The internet was more easily accessed. It used to be in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s that the only way to get on the internet was to dial up with a modem and your telephone, because that's how the internet was wired, through these cable systems that phones connected into. And that, of course, those modem sounds were really distinctive. But then with the development of broadband from cable and satellite companies, internet access was sped up, but also more universal. And it led to the question, back to Lanier and Gore, their initial vision, did the internet become a great equalizer? Early on, there was a lot of conversation about the digital divide, and those who had access to the internet and those who didn't, and how those with more resources, more education, more income, those who could afford the personal computers, the cable subscriptions, we began to see a gap in the haves and the have-nots. So the more you had, the more you got, because you were able to get more out of the internet. But today, this characterization of there being a digital divide, it's not quite accurate. Instead, what we see are different levels of connectivity. And I can illustrate this through remote learning in the era of COVID. You all, many of you, took in our class the extra credit survey. And by the way, if you haven't taken the survey, it's still open for 6 more days. And about 11% of you said that you have to share your devices and you don't have as much time on them as you need. So that's one illustration of how there isn't a you're on or you're off, but instead a you're on, but you don't have as much access as those who have more devices in their homes. Excuse me. Another quarter of you said that you have unstable or unreliable internet access. That is, you may not, your internet goes out frequently, or you have to use a data plan. And if you've hit the ceiling on your data plan, then that's it for you for that month, unless you buy more data. So even in our class, and a class full of people who are in college, we still see a sort of continuum of those who have many devices and who have stable internet access, and those who have less stable internet access and less ability to go online as much as you would like. So this is the end of Module 3, Part 1. In the next module, we'll talk about some very specific uses of the internet that are unique to the current decade. So we will pick up again with Part 2 of Module 3.